Welcome back to Cerebrella. Today's story takes us behind the palace walls and the flashing cameras into the real life of one of the most photographed women in history. This is the true story of Diana, Princess of Wales, told in her own voice, built entirely from the record she left behind. Get comfortable, and let's begin. On a July afternoon in 1981, 700 million people around the world stopped what they were doing to watch a 19-year-old kindergarten teacher's assistant step out of a glass carriage in a dress with a 25-foot train and become the most photographed woman on Earth. They called it a fairy tale. It was not. Behind the carriage, the tiara, and the smile that the whole planet fell in love with, there was a young woman who was lonely inside the largest palace in the world, who struggled in private with her own mental health while performing perfect composure in public, and who would spend the rest of her life fighting to be seen as a person, not a symbol. This is her story, told the way she might have told it herself, built entirely from the record she left behind, her public words, her documented actions, and the causes she gave her life to. Not the tabloid version, the real one. This is Diana, the girl from Park House. I was born Diana Frances Spencer on the 1st of July, 1961, at Park House, on the grounds of the royal estate at Sandringham in Norfolk. My family, the Spencers, had served the British royal family for generations, not as royalty ourselves, but close enough to it that the palace was practically our neighbor. People assume, because of how my life turned out, that I was raised for the role I eventually stepped into. The truth is almost the opposite. My childhood was, in many ways, quietly difficult. My parents' marriage collapsed when I was young. They separated in 1967 when I was 6, and their divorce was finalized 2 years later. I was placed in my father's custody, which was unusual for the time. My father would later inherit the title of Earl Spencer, and I became Lady Diana Spencer. I was not, by most accounts, an academically distinguished student. I attended Riddlesworth Hall and later West Heath Girls' School, and I left formal education without particularly impressive results. What I did have, even then, was an instinct for kindness, a pull toward people who were overlooked or struggling, long before I understood what to do with that instinct. By my late teens, I was living a fairly ordinary life for someone of my background in London, sharing a flat with friends, working as a kindergarten teacher's assistant at the Young England School in Pimlico. I liked that job. I liked children. I had no way of knowing that within a few years, that ordinary life would end completely and never come back. The engagement the world watched. I had known Charles, Prince of Wales, for some time before our relationship became serious. My own sister had, at one point, dated him. Our courtship, such as it was, unfolded largely under intense secrecy, and then, once the press caught the scent of it, under intense public scrutiny. Our engagement was announced on February 24th, 1981. I chose my own engagement ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, a design so striking it's still instantly recognizable today. I was 19 years old. Charles was 32. I want to be honest about something the fairy tale narrative usually skips over. The months between our engagement and our wedding were some of the loneliest of my life. I left my job and moved first into Clarence House, then into Buckingham Palace itself, to prepare for a wedding the entire world was about to watch. One biographer who studied that period later described my life at the time as, quite simply, incredibly lonely. I was surrounded by protocol, by staff, by expectation, and increasingly isolated from the ordinary friendships I'd had just months before. On July 29th, 1981, I married Charles at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, in front of roughly 3,000 guests and a television audience estimated at over 700 million people worldwide. I wore a dress with 10,000 pearls and a 25-foot train. I became, that day, Diana, Princess of Wales. I was the first Englishwoman in over 300 years to marry a man who was first in line to the British throne. I did not fully understand, standing at that altar, what that history would demand of me. Motherhood and a marriage unraveling. My first son, William, was born on June 21st, 1982. My second son, Harry, arrived on September 15th, 1984. Motherhood gave me something the palace never quite could, a role that felt entirely mine, uncomplicated by protocol. I made a deliberate choice, one that was somewhat unusual for royal parents at the time, to be closely, physically involved in raising my sons myself, rather than leaving the bulk of it to nannies and staff. But behind the public image of a young, glowing royal family, my marriage was quietly falling apart. I have spoken publicly, later in my life, about how difficult those early years actually were. I struggled with postnatal depression. I struggled with bulimia, a condition that, at the time, very few public figures ever discussed openly, let alone a member of the royal family. I want to be direct about this, because I was direct about it myself later, when I finally had the chance. Those struggles were real. They were serious. And for a long time, I faced them almost entirely alone, inside a palace that had no real framework for supporting a young woman going through something like that. By 1992, the strain in my marriage to Charles had become impossible to hide. That year, journalist Andrew Morton published a book, Diana, Her True Story, built on secretly recorded conversations with me and people close to me. It detailed for the first time publicly the truth about my marriage, including my eating disorder and my emotional struggles during those years. In December of 1992, our formal separation was announced to the British public. 3 years later, in November of 1995, I sat down for an interview with journalist Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama program. I want to be honest about the complicated legacy of that interview, because history itself has been honest about it. Decades later, an investigation found that Bashir had used deceptive methods, including forged documents, to gain my trust and secure that conversation. I did not know that at the time. What I said in that interview, though, was true, and it was mine. I spoke about my depression. I spoke about my bulimia. And referring to Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, I said, well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. That interview became the tipping point. Weeks later, Buckingham Palace announced that the Queen had written to both Charles and me, advising us to divorce. Our divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. I kept my title as Princess of Wales, but I was formally stripped of the style Her Royal Highness, a decision, by most accounts, that Charles insisted upon, even though the Queen herself had reportedly been willing to let me keep it. Finding my own voice. Losing the formal machinery of royal life turned out to be, in a strange way, the beginning of something more honest for me. Freed from certain constraints, I was able to devote myself more fully to the causes that actually mattered to me. Work I had already been doing for years, but which I could now pursue with fewer restrictions on how I spoke about it. I had spent years quietly visiting people that much of society preferred not to look at directly. In the mid-1980s, at the height of public fear and misinformation about HIV and AIDS, I made a point of visiting hospital wards and shaking hands, without gloves, with patients. A small physical gesture that did more to challenge public stigma than almost any speech could have. I made unannounced visits to AIDS hospices, like Mildmay in London, specifically instructing staff to keep those visits out of the press because they weren't for publicity. They were simply the right thing to do. In my final years, I turned much of my focus toward a cause that had almost nothing to do with royal tradition: the global landmine crisis. In January of 1997, I traveled to Angola as part of an international Red Cross campaign and allowed myself to be photographed walking through a minefield in a protective visor and flak jacket. An image that was seen around the world and that put enormous political pressure on governments to act. That same war, I spoke at a landmines conference in London and traveled to Washington, D.C. to support the American Red Cross's campaign against landmines. In August of 1997, just weeks before my death, I visited landmine survivors and clearance projects in Bosnia, among the very last public work I would ever do. I was often called the world's most photographed woman. I understood by then that the same cameras that had made my life unbearable at times could also be pointed toward something that actually mattered, toward landmine fields, toward hospital wards, toward the people the world preferred to look away from. If I had to live under that much attention, I decided I would at least try to spend it on something worth the cost. Paris, August 1997. On the night of August 31st, 1997, I was in a car traveling through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris with my companion, Dodi Fayed, and our driver, Henri Paul. The car crashed. Dodi and Henri Paul were killed. I died from my injuries later that night. I was 36 years old. In the years that followed, official investigations, both a French inquiry in 1999 and a formal British inquest that concluded in 2008, found that the crash was an accident, caused primarily by the driver, who was found to have been intoxicated at the time, worsened by the high-speed pursuit of photographers following the car. The findings were thorough, and they were clear. I want to be honest with you about that, because in the years since, all kinds of theories have circulated about that night, most of them without credible evidence behind them. The official record, examined more than once, tells a much simpler and sadder story than the rumors do. What happened after my death, though, was something almost no one, including, I suspect, the royal family itself, was fully prepared for. An estimated 2.5 billion people around the world watched my funeral at Westminster Abbey on September 6, 1997. Flowers piled outside Kensington Palace in mountains that took weeks to clear. It became clear in the days after my death that whatever complicated relationship I'd had with the institution I married into, the public's relationship with me had never been complicated at all. I never asked to be called the people's princess. Somebody else gave me that name, and it stuck. Because in the end, it was true, in a way that had nothing to do with titles or protocol. I was, for most of my adult life, a deeply public person, carrying a set of very private struggles. Depression, an eating disorder, a marriage that was never what it appeared to be from the outside. I did not always handle those struggles perfectly, and I never pretended to. But I also refused to hide them entirely, at a time when almost no public figure, let alone a member of the British royal family, was willing to admit to any of it. I would rather be remembered for the AIDS wards I sat in when almost no one else would. For the minefields I walked through in a flak jacket to force the world to pay attention. And for 2 sons I tried, in my own imperfect way, to raise as normally as I possibly could, inside an entirely abnormal life. I was Diana Spencer before I was ever Diana, Princess of Wales. And in the end, I think it was that first, ordinary girl from Norfolk, the one who liked children and couldn't walk past someone who was struggling, who actually explains everything I did with the extraordinary, complicated life that came after her. So, that was the story of Diana, Princess of Wales, a girl from Norfolk who became a global icon and who spent her life trying to be seen as more than just a symbol. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more true stories from history, told the way they deserve to be told. Thank you for listening.